Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the new Yankee Workshop. Today we're going to build a custom entry door for an old house using methods and materials that the old-timers wouldn't recognize. But the results are spectacular and the door should last a lifetime. That's next, right here in the new Yankee Workshop. This old Greek Revival farmhouse, built in 1851, didn't always look this way. We have a picture from the 1920s that actually shows a porch that went over this entryway with a roof, so it was very well protected. In 1975, the porch was removed, which exposed this door to more of the weather. It is on the north side. It doesn't get much sun, but it does get weather. Here's the door that was there, and I got to say, it's shown its age. The solid wood panels are cracked. You can see all the way through. There's some separation between the moldings and these stiles. And the lock. Originally there was a full mortise lock here which compromised the tenons that join these rails to the stiles. That was replaced with a Dutchman. And we'd like to put a nice new full mortise lock here, but we can't do it with this narrow stile and this Dutchman. This is a north face and the room is pretty dark inside, so we'd like to add a couple more pieces of glass up here. And there's another thing. In the summertime, this door is open for ventilation. And rather than seeing this dark green paint, we'd like to see a nice natural wood door, like mahogany. So let's get in the shop and get started. Many door makers prefer mahogany. It's expensive, but it's very stable. And I was lucky. I had some short pieces left over from previous projects to make this door. Now let's talk about the anatomy of a door. There are two long pieces on each edge of the door. They're called the stiles. There's a top rail, a cross rail, down here one that's a bit wider, a mid rail, or often referred to as a lock rail, and the bottom rail. In the middle there's another stile that divides the door into panels. Now if you'd like to build an entry door, a measure drawing of the one we're building today will be available, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. The first thing I want to do is size this stock for thickness. I want to make one surface of all of these boards flat. Now I would like to take it to my surface planer, but if the board has a twist, the twist will just follow through the planer. I'll never get it perfectly flat. So the ideal tool is the joiner. Now if I put the board down, you can see that it's not flat. It's not even sitting on that table very well. But if I make a few passes through the joiner, that surface will be nice and flat. Then I can take it to the surface planer and get it to the right thickness. But before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. With all the parts of the door surface planed to the correct thickness, now I have to treat the edges. So it's back to the joiner. Now the first thing that I want to check on the joiner is the squareness of the fence. So using my combination square, I just set it on the table, butt it up against the edge. There's no gap, so I know it's square. A couple passes through on the edge will straighten it and square it up. Now I'm going to rip it to width. I place the jointed edge against the fence. I've set the fence to be 1/32 of an inch larger than what I need in the finished piece. And then I'll make another pass at the joiner. But with all the stock prepared, I'm now ready to make some final cuts. I'm going to leave the two long stiles a little bit longer than I need in the finished door. But all the interior parts will have to be cut very carefully and accurately so they're nice and square and I get a nice tight joint. For the last several minutes, I've been laying out the mortises for all the connecting joints of the pieces. Here I've clamped the two long stiles together to give me a nice wide base onto which to rest my router as I make mortises. I've already machined this mortise. It's a 1/2 inch wide and about 2.5 inches deep. I've also machined a mortise in the adjoining rail. Same thing, 2.5 inches deep. They'll get connected by a technique known as a loose tenon. Here's the tenon. When I come to assembly, I'll glue it into one piece like this, and it doesn't have to be tight top to bottom, it just has to be snug on the sides. Then I'll apply glue to the rest of the tenon and the adjoining joint, mortise, and when it all comes together, it'll be nice and flush, and this joint will be as strong as if I had actually cut the tenon in the piece of wood itself. And it only takes a router to make it. Let me show you how I make the loose tenons. I take a piece of mahogany and I plane it down until the thickness matches the width of the mortises I've already routed in the rails. Now I want to round over the corners, so I'm going to use a 1/4 inch round over bit doing all 4 corners. Well, good morning. Last night I stayed at the shop long enough to complete all the mortises. Then I made all the loose tenons, and here I have a dry fit. Everything seems to be fitting nicely, and it's square, so now I'll break it apart and do the final glue up. Now the glue that I'm using is a waterproof glue, and it has a fairly slow set time. I have about 8 minutes of open time, but that means I can't try to glue the entire door at once, so we'll do it in segments, and I'm going to start with the center stile into all the rails. So there's glue on the tenon and in the mortise. I'll slip those together and just carefully glue it. When I form these tenons, the thickness is critical. I want a nice snug joint in the thickness of the piece, but as you can see on the sides, there's a little bit of leeway, and that will help me align all the parts when I do the final clamping. Now here's the second sub-assembly. Sort of looks like a cross. Gives us our window openings. All right, here's the 4th element. Get that one on. Well, there's no fooling around now. I don't want this glue to set before I apply the clamps. And of course I'll wipe off any squeeze out, otherwise it's going to show in the final finish. Okay, I'm running about 11 minutes. Time for the first clamp. Right down the center. Now take note that I'm installing and gluing all the loose tenons into the rails before I attach the stiles. And I have a little more time now because I'm not applying any clamps yet. Well, now I got to really get moving because I'm going to try to glue up all the tenons for both stiles at the same time. No fooling around now. Okay, wish me luck. Get these started. Okay, there's 1, 2. Okay. Well, now we'll let this cook for a while before we do anything else to it. Well, no matter how well the parts fit together, there's always room for a little sanding with the random orbit sander. Now that's the first of 2 passes, one from each side of the door that I'm going to make to produce a groove. I'm using a slot cutting bit, which will give me a 1/2 inch depth of that groove. The groove is going to receive these splines made out of exterior grade plywood. It'll slip into the groove, be glued in place, and it provides for a dam, so if water were to get behind the molding, it can't go through to the other side of the door, and it also gives me a nailing strip for the moldings. Okay, that's good. Now I got this door construction technique from a friend of ours, Dave Chastanet, who has a woodworking shop in Rhode Island where they make dozens of doors on a weekly basis. And that should just slip right into place, and that'll give me about a 1/2-inch nailer for my moldings. All right. With this last piece in, now we can make some moldings. All right, now our molding starts out as some mahogany that's 3/4 of an inch thick and 1 inch wide. The first bit that I'm going to use is a 1/4 inch radius cove bit, and I've also installed a feather board to hold the stock down. I'm going to have to make a pass, raise the bit slightly, and make a second pass. Now I've changed bits and installed a 1/2-inch diameter, half-round bit. I've put 2 feather boards on, one to keep the stock tight to the table and the other to keep it tight up against the fence. Well, now I'm starting to fit the moldings on the inside of the door. The corners are simply mitered, and they'll set in place right on top of that spline, and I'll secure them with some brads. So before I leave tonight, I think I'll cut all the moldings for the inside of the door. Well, good morning. I stayed with it last night and fitted all the moldings on the inside of the door, and they're secured in place with some pin nails, so you hardly see them at all. Now when I flip it down, I'll show you the other side, you can see the back side of the molding. I also cut up some pieces of 1/4 inch mahogany veneer plywood, and those drop down onto the moldings that I've already installed and in between those filler blocks or splines, both at the top and the bottom. I also spent some time working with some solid mahogany. I planed down some pieces to about a 1/2-inch thickness, nice straight grain mahogany, and those will drop on top of the plywood panels and become the exterior side of the door. Now you'll note that the panel is proud of the spline by about 1/8 of an inch. Here are the moldings, and you can see it doesn't go down to the spline. So the next step is to rabbet the 4 edges of the panel enough so that this molding comes down even with the spline. To make the rabbet, I've set up my stacked dado and installed a feather board to keep the stock tight to the table. Let me show you a couple more points of this system. You can now understand why I use solid wood on the exterior panels rather than plywood. The plywood core would have been exposed when I made this rabbet. Now here's another tip from Dave. This molding, when applied, and this panel prevents water from getting into the door. When water comes down the face of this panel, this rabbet allows it to shed away from the molding instead of behind it. You'll also take note that I've left a little play side to side to let the panel expand and contract. For the molding on the exterior of the door, I'm cutting this very small groove called a quirk, and it acts as a keyway to hold the caulking in place. Well, now I'm going to take a little break from the woodworking and prime the back side of all the panels, both the plywood and the solid wood. And this will help protect the wood from any condensation problems. For the last several minutes, I've been fitting the moldings on the outside of the door. I have all the moldings fitted that hold the wood panels in place. Now I'm working on the molding that's going to hold the glass in place, and I want to show you the difference in the molding. Here's the molding for the wood panels. It's 3/4 of an inch thick. Here's the molding for the glass. It's about 15/16 of an inch thick to make up the difference between the panel thickness and the glass thickness. Now you might recall that I cut a groove or a quirk in the bottom of the molding. I've also added one on the side for these glass moldings. That'll get sealed with caulking and make a tight joint between the rails and the stiles. Now this is a clear urethane caulking. It'll act as an adhesive, it stays flexible, and it's paintable. So I just want to bed a nice groove. Fill that groove with caulking, leave a little extra stick out, and we will get a nice seal. Now I'm just using pin nails, and I have this gauge block. I'm just making it flush with the inside of the rails and stiles, and just angle in about 3 pins in each piece. Now this caulking will also accept paint and varnish. Now for the wood panel installation. First, the plywood panel goes in. No glue or caulking. I want that to float around. Then I'm going to put a bead of the caulking right down the middle of this panel. I want the two panels to stick together, but I want the outer panel to be able to expand and contract, so that's why it's right in the center. I'll drop this in and wiggle it back and forth, make sure it's secure. The next thing I want to do is put a very small bead of caulking right in the corner, all the way around. And now here's a bead for that cork. We don't want to put any caulking on the panel, just on that ledge or the spline. Now I'll just secure these moldings with some 1-inch pins. All right, now I'm ready to set the glass. So I'm putting a bead of this urethane caulking all around the inside of the molding. And we got lucky. We found this bullseye glass, which is very classic on old houses, and we had a supplier right around the corner, but most glass shops around the country can get it for you. Just going to bed it into that urethane and apply the moldings on this side. Now I set these interior moldings without any caulk in case we have to ever replace the glass, and just attach them with some more of those pin nails. Well, now it's time to mortise for the hinges so we can hang this door. And we're lucky here in the workshop, we have a mortising jig. It's made up of 3 templates, which will give me the correct outline for the mortise, which I'll make with a router. The templates are separated by these bars, and that's determined by the height of the door. It gives us the right spacing for the hinges. Now, after I mortise out for the hinges in the door, I can take this whole assembly over to the door jamb, tack it in place, route it out with the router again, and the mortises will be perfectly aligned. When I set it on the door, I do have to pay attention to one thing, which is the top of the jig. I want a 1/16 of an inch clearance to the jamb, so we set it there. And then there are these pins. You just drive them into the door, and that holds it in place. Here I've equipped my router with this collar, which rides around the inside of the template. And I'm using a mortising bit. Now I can remove the jig and square up the corners. We're using a nice 4-inch polished brass hinge. Well, it only took a minute to secure the jig to the jamb. Now I'm ready to route out for the hinges. I can't tell you how many of these hinges I've mortised with a tape measure and a chisel and a butt gauge. This jig makes it a lot easier. Now, weather stripping this door is a snap because when the door jamb comes from the manufacturer, it has a kerf cut in it, and they supply you with this flexible, foam-filled weather strip which just slides into the kerf, and it'll fill any gaps between the door and the jamb, making it airtight. I've sealed the bottom of the door, and now I'm going to attach this door sweep, and that's going to get secured in place with a few staples. Well, before we put any more hardware on this door, I want to protect the outside with several coats of spar varnish because the rains are coming. Well, now it's time for the hardware, and we're going to be using a nice full mortise lock. So the first thing I have to do is cut a mortise for the body of the lock. This part has to be recessed into the door. Now we're lucky, we have a lock mortiser. It clamps to the door so it's nice and secure. It's square to the door and parallel to the stile. It has a router motor and a shaft which goes to a fairly aggressive bit. Now as I crank the mechanism, the bit will go up and down as it's turning, and it will ratchet into the door a little bit at a time until I get just to the right depth, leaving me a pocket that's square and centered on the stile. Now in the old days, carpenters had to use a bit brace and a chisel. Took a while, and you had to be pretty good. Okay, let's check the depth. All right, that's good. Now we can take the mechanism off the door. The next step is to mortise for the lock front, this piece right here with the trim, so that when it's installed, it will be flush with the edge of the stile. So I have another jig, and this time I'm using a router with a collar, and that'll cut it to the correct size. Now just square up the corners with a nice sharp chisel. Now I have to mark and drill a series of holes for the various mechanisms, the lock cylinder, the thumb latch, the spindle for the handle. The trick here is to get the holes square and straight. With the lock body in place, I can now screw in the key cylinder and the escutcheon that covers the hole. Now the exterior trim and the thumb latch. That gets secured with a couple bolts. Now for the inside trim. I've got to get this little thumb latch into the deadbolt so we can operate that. And then a nice heavy brass knob, and we'll secure that in place. And lastly, this little finished trim plate on the edge of the door. Now for the latch side, there's this little black plastic box, a reinforcing plate, and then a trim plate. And the first thing I want to do is mortise out for the box. With everything chiseled out and mortised, slip in the box and the reinforcing plate, and we'll attach that with a couple screws. All right, there's the last bit of hardware. The weather stripping is all snapped back into place. Let's see how we did. That's great, nice and solid. Certainly a big improvement over the drafty old door that was here. We have an elegant, energy-efficient, beautiful entry door. And it's the first entry door that I built from scratch. It was fun. Now let me show you what we're going to build next time. We call it an old pine dry sink. The inspiration came from a visit to Arlington House, the former home of Robert E. Lee in Arlington, Virginia. We made ours out of reclaimed pine. We had a copper pan fabricated, so tending these plants will be a breeze, and there's plenty of storage down below. So join us next time as I build an old pine sink right here in the new Yankee Workshop.
If you've enjoyed this new Yankee project, you may want to try some of the others. There are projects meant for the workshop, the garden, the kitchen, and many more. So whether you're a fan of Shaker style, or colonial, arts and crafts, or Chippendale, there may be a Norm project you'd like to build. Whether it's a clock or a gazebo, a picnic bench or a Windsor chair, a child's toy or a sailboat, visit the New Yankee website at www.newyankee.com for a complete listing.